Well, welcome, folks, to season 2, episode 1 of the Hall of Fame Road Trip podcast, exclusively on the Kirk Minahan YouTube network. Happy to be back. It was a busy summer, kids graduating high school, getting kids to college, family vacations, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm back and wanted to thank Kirk and Dave Cullinane for their ongoing support. So I'm so thrilled to have Tyrell Lisson with us. Tyrell is the host of one of my favorite podcasts going, The Band, The History. I discovered this pod about a year and a half ago, Tyrell, and look forward to your each and every episode. The in-depth nature that you and the care that you put into the information is just terrific. And for a big fan like myself and all your fans, it's just terrific information. I've learned so much, and just welcome. Thanks for coming.
Thank you. No, I appreciate the very kind words. It's always a pleasure hearing folks' reaction to the show, that they like it. Obviously, I'm very passionate about the band, so any way I can share the legacy and the stories is always something that I enjoy doing. And thank you for having me on the show. I'm looking forward to it. I always like any excuse to talk about the band.
Me too. And over the summer, how certain albums you get stuck on, during the course of a period of time. And for whatever the reason, I landed on Rock of Ages all summer long. And
Nice.
For the folks listening, most folks lean towards The Last Waltz as kind of the definitive live recording of the band. But I would recommend you checking out Rock of Ages from 72, I believe. It was released. It was from New Year's Eve in 71, and just amazing. So you've been on my mind, and I'm thrilled that you were able to join the pod. So today, we're going to really talk about and focus on a period of the band's history that doesn't get a lot of play, and it's the reunion era, right? So post Last Waltz, and specifically, we're going to talk about the 1994 Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction of the band, which is an interesting story in itself. But what I thought we could do, Tyrell, is just kind of give a real, for the listeners who may not be as familiar with the group, just kind of do some bullet points that gets us up to the reunion period. So,
Sure.
The band, some might say they're the godfathers of Americana music, country rock, but just so innovative and so influential. The band was made up of Rick Danko on bass and vocals, Levon Helm on the drums and vocals, Garth Hudson on all of the keyboards, Richard Manuel piano and vocals, and Robbie Robertson lead guitar and wrote a majority of the songs. So the band actually got together in the early 60s under Ronnie Hawkins, who was a Canadian rockabilly artist. So it was Ronnie and the Hawks. Is that correct, Tyrell?
Yep. Ronnie and the Hawks. Ronnie is an interesting case himself. From Arkansas originally, grew up in that same area, in and around those same types of guys like your Johnny Cashes, brushed elbows with the likes of Conway Twitty and Elvis Presley. Found more success up in Canada with the burgeoning rock and roll scene. It was a few years later in Canada, but Conway Twitty actually pointed Ronnie up to that direction, being like, they pay more and they require less of you. So I would recommend going up to Canada, try to break in. He took a young Levon Helm up there with him.
Okay.
Another Arkansas local. And they started to make an imprint as the premier rockabilly band in Toronto. Along the way, Ronnie Hawkins has become the godfather of Canadian rock and roll. His ability to recruit and develop talent has been next to none, and that's where he started slowly assembling the band that we know as the band, which included, Robbie Robertson, Rick Danko, Garth Hudson, Richard Manuel, and Levon Helm, as you mentioned. So
Right.
Ronnie is the inception of that group. A lot of them learned to play and learned what it really meant to be musicians with Ronnie
Right.
Hawkins.
And he was featured. He was the first performer at the Last Waltz, correct? The first guest, I guess, who came out.
Yeah, exactly. Ronnie continued to mean a lot to all of the guys and remain close, regardless of any kind of ill will towards the end of their original stay with him. They were ready, obviously, to develop their own thing, but Ronnie Hawkins remained a mentor and somebody that was deeply important to them.
Right. So following that, um, the guys who eventually became the band found their way to being Bob Dylan's backing band in 1965 and 1966. How exactly? And they were part of that infamous first electric tour of Dylan's. How did that connection come about?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. So obviously, after several years and several hundreds of hours playing with Ronnie Hawkins, similar to the Beatles in Hamburg, these guys had developed into some of the premier white blues players in the world. And they went out on their own under various different names, under the Hawks, under the Levon Helm Sextet at one point, because there was a few other guys there,
Right.
Levon and the Hawks, you name it. And they were performing and doing essentially the circuits of Canada through the Chicklin circuit down in the South. And they were starting to get a reputation by themselves. They were doing some studio work with, the likes of John Hammond, a great blues player. And, Bob Dylan got turned on by an assistant. Again, the Hawks were very, infamous at this point. Dylan was looking to go electric. He was looking for that kind of ultimate band to go behind him, but he liked Robbie, so he talked to Robbie. He really liked Levon, and originally it was just Levon and Robbie who kind of stepped in to do a few performances with him, those first kind of electric performances. But as much has been said, these guys, at least at this point, they were a brotherhood. They were in it together, and Robbie and Levon were like, "Listen, Bob, we would really be interested in backing you and going on this world tour with you, but we can't do it without Rick, Richard, and Garth. We're a band, we're a unit, and if you can't do that, that's fine."
Mhm.
Dylan said yes, and kind of next part is obviously well documented, but the group kind of went on tour and backed them. They were the Hawks technically, but everybody kind of referred to them as the band, Bob Dylan and the band. And they were booed because the folkies didn't like that Dylan was going electric. But again, I think that was a next crucial element in the band's development. Adversity is something that I think we all need to kind of become the best at what we do, and they definitely dealt with that on the road.
Right, right. And so following that tour, there's the famous Bob Dylan had a motorcycle accident up in Woodstock. Side note, I grew up about 20 minutes from Woodstock, New York.
Oh,
So
nice.
I spent a lot of time down there. And I was actually fortunate enough in 1980 to meet Rick Danko, and who was just as cool as I could have hoped he would have been. So shout out to Rick. But so with Dylan up there, was that the impetus of the guys moving up to Woodstock as well? I mean, was it based on Dylan and to work with him, or what was the next steps?
Yeah, it was an interesting period. Obviously, yeah, Dylan got in the motorcycle accident. I think the motorcycle accident was the impetus for a lot of things. I think it was probably a little overstated. Dylan was in bad shape. He had a really bad pill addiction. He was just really worse for wear, and he needed time to recuperate and recover. Albert Grossman, who was managing him at the time, had a place in upstate New York, famously for a century now, has been an artist colony.
Yeah.
And Peter Yarrow from Peter Paul and Mary was up there too. Grossman was like, let's get you up here to recover out of the limelight of like New York City. And the band was on retainer still. They were living in New York in hotels. They were going back to Toronto to visit family and friends. And they went up to Woodstock because they're like, well, we're going to put you on retainer, and just be on hand here if Bob wants to write some music. and informal jam sessions started to happen after the band got their famous clubhouse and home in which some of them lived in, Big Pink. They also jammed at Bob's house, etc. That became known as the Basement Tapes. But again, that was another kind of evolutionary stage for Bob as a musician, writing material, having the time to do that. But also, it was the next step for the band from going from performer to writers themselves. They had the typewriter that they would all kind of sit around and type away. They'd get up, somebody else would type a few words down. During that early period, you saw a lot of songwriting development from Robbie and Richard, which then went on to kind of shade their first two and their most famous albums. But everybody was contributing. They were recording very rudimentarily in the basement. Garth Hudson was kind of in charge of that. And that really kind of heralded in their own unique sound, their mix of blues, jazz, New Orleans sounds, folk, all of it, concoction that we now know as roots rock or Americana, was kind of really being developed by Bob and the band during that period. And they also wanted to sign their own deal. They thought they were ready, and with the help of Albert Grossman, they shopped the group around and they signed. And I believe it was an 8-album deal with Capitol Records,
Right.
pretty monster deal. But it was kind of that period between 66, 67 was the impetus of them becoming what we know them as now.
Right, the band, and the debut album came out in '68. Music from Big Pink.
Yeah.
Very influential album. The Weight obviously is the big, well-known song, but Tears of Rage, I Shall Be Released, This Wheel's on Fire, really, really good debut album. Followed up pretty quickly the following year by their self-titled The Band album, which is also known by some as the Brown album, which is a stone cold classic. Rag Mama Rag, The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Up on Cripple Creek, King Harvest, which on Rock of Ages is just incredible. Just an incredible version. So 2 albums out, critical acclaim all over the place, seemingly very influential. They played at the original Woodstock Festival in the middle of the night, if I'm correct.
Yeah, pretty late. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
No, it was a very rapid extension, and you have to remember, you have 4 Canadian kids. A lot of them grew up on farms around the city. They're not very educated in the ways of the world. They know how to play music really well. A lot of them came from poor backgrounds. Levon, sharecropper family. Same with Levon, kind of inner city. They grew up in, well, now it's a very fancy area, nice area of Toronto, but Cabbagetown was not a very nice area back then. So these guys got a lot of money, a lot of fame really quickly. They were mysterious due to a series of events with, car accidents and not wanting the limelight. They didn't do a lot of press for those first 2 albums. They didn't tour very much at the beginning. So people are like, who are these guys? What are they up to? And it was really a 3-album run. 68, Music from Big Pink through Stage Fright, which is considered by many to be their classic era. That's 3 years, 68, 69, 70. And, you got to remember too, like, this was recorded quickly. They didn't even start seeing their first paychecks until that 3rd album came out, because that's how quickly it happened. They started getting paychecks and they're like, oh, but it's been it'd been 3 albums. It's insane. But that was more common back then. The Beatles, they did all of their stuff in like 8 years, 9 years. Creedence Clearwater Revival, they did it in like 6, I think, maybe less. So it's like these guys were going fast and furious. And at the beginning, it was good, like a lot of things. It's good until kind of the excesses of money and like hanger-ons and drugs and alcohol consumption, which ravaged the entire group. Some more than others, but it definitely was a problem for everybody. And you start to gain independence. You have people whispering in your ear, you should do this, you should do that. And I think it was hard to maintain, but without a doubt, it was a very concentrated, effective effort.
Yeah, and so they rolled on. They had the album Cahoots, the Rock of Ages, which I've mentioned. They did a cover album, Moondog Matinee. I mean, in 1973, they played a famous event, show in Watkins Glen, New York, with the Almonds and the Dead, to a reported 600,000 folks. I mean,
Yeah, that number goes all over the place, but we just know that it's one of the biggest shows of all time. It was
right.
massive.
Right. Then they kind of went back to the future a little bit and reunited with Dylan in '74 for a 6-week tour,
Hmm.
January and February of that year, I believe. And then the Basement Tapes came out in '75. Northern Lights, Southern Cross also came out in '75. Ophelia's on that record, which I love. Makes No Difference. And again, the
Hmm.
live version of that at the Last Waltz is just
Killer.
killer. So that leads us up to Thanksgiving night of 1976, and um, leading up to the Last Waltz. I mean, you hear, depending on whose book you've read or what you've heard,
Hmm.
it seems to be that Robbie was the driving force of kind of ending it.
Yeah.
Um, but, uh, what were the feelings of the other four? It doesn't sound like it was much of a democracy at that point.
Yeah, it's tough. Like you have to take into account all of the different accounts. And I just did like 6 episodes on the Last Waltz. I
Mm-hmm.
really tried to dig in, and we have famously there's Robbie's account, famously there's Levon's account, but I was also interested in seeing what I could dig up about the others and what they thought. And I think generally the thought was that they didn't necessarily want it to end. They understood that they maybe need to take a break, but the narrative has kind of changed over time. Originally, The Last Waltz was a completion of the touring life of the band, and that at least they had agreed to, regroup and start recording a la the Beatles in a studio setting only. But, the more I dig into that, the more I kind of start to form the opinion that that was just a denial, and they mainly said that because that's all they had ever known playing with each other. Um, Before the Last Waltz, Rick Danko and Levon Helm signed solo deals. Levon signed with ABC Records, Rick Danko signed with Arista Records. And they were kind of tired of the control that Robbie had over the band. Robbie, in his perspective, felt that it was a needed control because, when you have a unit like this that, is feeding and employing multiple people and there's an expectation, there needs to be somebody that's the driving force of that unit. And Robbie felt that that was up to him. But overall, I think the sentiment was uneasy in multiple interviews from 76 through 77, 78. All of them talk about getting back together and recording, but
Mm-hmm.
that never really ended up happening. But the Last Waltz itself obviously is famous. uh, you know it's something that I think has a complicated history for a lot of like diehard band fans, because it's that document that people know. It's what gets a lot of people into the band. It creates the kind of story and the narrative that people see the band as. But there was lots to unpack there, and a lot of people weren't happy with it. But there's no denying that it's the greatest concert film of all time, and that it brung together some of the best musicians of all time for an
Right.
ultimate performance,
Yeah.
and like that can never be taken away from it. So it's like that's the beauty of the band. It's always complicated, it's always multifaceted, and that's one of the best parts about them, I think.
Yeah, and a lot of people, you see it on Twitter. A lot of band fans, hold negative feelings towards Robbie. But to your point, and actually earlier you mentioned it. In the beginning they were all contributing to the
Hmm.
writing, and by the end, due to addiction and other whatever else was going on, Robbie kind of had to shoulder all of that and kind of keep an eye on the business end when the other four
Hmm.
seemingly weren't that interested in worrying about it.
Yeah, and I think they suffered ultimately because of that.
Yeah.
The collaborative nature of those first two albums, especially, proof is in the pudding that you needed all of them to make that stuff. And when, Robbie had to shoulder the load for whatever reason, drugs, his ability, his desire to control things, it did suffer. You know what I mean? Like it just was the nature of it, unfortunately. And I still think, and I've been a big supporter that those albums outside of those first two are actually wonderful, especially what was seen as their comeback album, Northern Lights, Southern Cross in '75. Like that is actually a remarkable album, especially from the likes of Garth Hudson, who was really innovative and developing a lot of stuff with synth at the time that you see on that album. But I'm right now exploring that kind of era after, like you wanted to talk about too, and there's a lot of people think it stops in
Right.
76 after the
Right.
last waltz, but
Yeah.
really there's almost, 3 decades of additional stories there that are very interesting and worth, talking about.
Yeah.
And it was a complicated period, right?
Yeah. So let's jump ahead a little bit. So first question I had was after the last waltz, when the four, because when they reunited, it was everybody but Robbie. In that was 1983. So was there a discussion at that point that Robbie should be involved? Was there some sort of vote taken? Was Levon's opinion so he was bitter, very bitter
Mhm.
with Robbie? I mean, was he not even considered from the other four when the reunion started?
Yeah, I think it's complicated. I think there's definitely chatter. Levon was angry. They all had their resentments towards Robbie. Some let that dictate a lot more. Rick and Garth and Richard maintained a little bit more of a cordial attitude with Robbie. To be honest, Robbie kind of left the music and that type of thing behind. He was more into Hollywood. He was more into
Film
making
school.
movies and stuff.
Yeah.
And they weren't necessarily friendly, but the conversations were had. There were conversations again later that Joe Forno actually detailed in his book
Yeah. Want to
that
bring that
recently
up?
came out.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, about Robbie coming back during the '90s. So there was intermittent conversations,
Mhm.
but Garth's talked about it. I don't necessarily think he would have been fully comfortable with it. Rick, I think he would have made it work. Richard, it's hard to say, obviously, because he passed during at least the latter part of those conversations in the '90s, but in the '80s, Levon was the original leader of the band. And
Right.
when Levon left off that Dylan tour, the power dynamics changed a little bit. And when the band got back together, it was very much Levon in charge again. So, if Levon was in the driver's seat and the rest were following him, you can kind of assume that I don't want to play with Robbie Robertson. That's going to be the decision, and the rest of the guys accepted that and moved on. I don't know if Robbie would have done it, even if he was asked. I don't think he would have done it at that period anyway,
Right.
and that's fine, right? So
Mhm.
that original '83 lineup was the four of them, including the Kate brothers, who were friends of Levon's and great musicians themselves, as well as Ron Eoff and Terry Cagle, who filled in on drums and bass respectively, before Jim Weeder joined the
Right.
band in '85, which I think was a seminal moment for them, and he was their guitarist from '85. From '85 to '99, he was their lead guitar player, phenomenal player in his own right. But yeah, it was a complicated time, of course.
Yeah. The thing at the time, and the thing I think about now is, 1983, the band getting back together with or
Hmm.
without Robbie. I mean, Levon and Rick and Richard were the singers. They were
Hmm.
playing very, very small clubs,
Hmm.
theaters. I mean, I would have thought a reunion of a band of that stature would have should have been lauded. What happened?
Yeah,
You know.
it's interesting because I think there's a couple things at play that you have to consider. First of all, look at just the music landscape of the '80s. There was kind of a shunning of the classic rock acts of the '60s and '70s. People were more interested in more of the modern things of the day of the '80s. Like, the '80s is a place where Michael Jackson exists, who's wonderful, right? But it's like that's the era there, not the band who, even at the time in the '60s, was shunning what was popular and was going back to the roots of genres that, weren't even popular at the time. The band, second, wasn't an act that ever really considered themselves a commercial entity. They shunned that as well. They're not the Stones. The Stones is like a commercial unit. They're amazing, but they also have like this serious business arm that's kept them, relevant. And the Beatles obviously are the Beatles. So there was that to play. I think there was inconsistencies too. I think they did play some large venues during the 80s. They played large theaters. They did play some, of the stadiums, but then there was intermittent periods where they're playing clubs and stuff. I think there was a lot of issues with management and tour managing and things that didn't necessarily play in their favor, which ultimately was one of the reasons why I think, somebody like Richard Manuel, who had gotten clean after the last waltz for a number of years, relapsed during his period in the band. He thought he had AIDS at one point. He started drinking and doing coke again. And he was a depressed person in an era where you don't talk about mental health, and you didn't have the kind of things that we have today to kind of help with that. And, I think going back on the road and the way in which they did it broke him in a lot of ways, and it broke the band again. So,
Well, that leads me to my next question, because tragically he took his own life in '86, and how did the rest of the group react to that? Was there a dynamic change? Did they just kind of keep on keeping on, as they say in a song, or was there a significant break at that point?
Yeah, I think there was a lack of understanding. In hindsight, it makes a lot of sense. Richard was severely depressed pretty much his entire life. There was multiple instances where he was like put on suicide watch. He was a self-mutilator to a degree.
Wow.
And they and he was a tortured soul. Richard, I will say, Richard's my favorite member of the band. It actually is tough to talk about it because I think he's a genius in his own right. But I think there was some denial of this. They talk about Rick and Levon talk about not believing that he did it intentionally, that it was some practical joke gone wrong. That's just hard to believe. It was intentional. Whether he was in like a drug craze or not, he did it, and there was a pattern there. Garth, I think, was kind of the one that he had the biggest voice, and that's funny for some people because he was kind of often the soft-spoken one. But Garth, again, he abstained from the larger, realities of that harsh lifestyle that they were living.
Right.
And when Richard died, Joe Forno talks about how it was Garth that was like, okay, we need to get out of here. We need to regroup. We need to get everything back on the same page. But it took them a few years. Right. I think they really reeled from that. Richard was considered the lead singer. He was the guy that, was the powerhouse that they were all in awe of in a lot of ways. And, it changed the dynamic again, and I don't know they knew how to deal with that.
Right.
But that made them reassess what they were doing, and the consistency of it. And that led into the 90s where there was another resurgence, and probably outside of the, the classic era was their strongest period from about like from about 92, 93 to, 95. That was a very strong era when they regrouped. But I think it was tough, and I don't know if they ever kind of dealt with it. And I think there was guilt there as well.
I'm sure. And, Jericho, which was their first album in 16 years, came out in 93. Terrific bunch of songs. I'm a Springsteen guy, and Atlantic City, to me, sacrilegious, but some days I feel the band's version is even stronger than Bruce's. But just, it was great to see that they got out there again and was getting some recognition. They were opening for some big bands in stadiums. I know they opened for The Dead during that period. They opened for Crosby, Stills, and Nash. And then that led us to the Hall of Fame. With 1994, They were
Hmm.
part of a tremendous class: Elton John, The Grateful Dead, Bob Marley, John Lennon, Rod Stewart, The Animals, and the band were right up there with all of them. Eric Clapton inducted them and did a terrific job. Eric, as you know, for the folks, famously was a huge band fan, and as the story has been told, they were the impetus for him quitting Cream because
Hmm.
he was tired of making that kind of music and wanted to make music similar to the band. And as the story goes, he one day he showed up in Woodstock and had all intentions of trying to work his way into the band, but never had the courage to ask them to join. But he gave a quote that night at the induction where he said, the band had a standard of craft that really didn't bow down to any kind of commerciality, and that rings true, and that kind of says it all for the
Hmm.
band. Um, Looking at the whole thing now, the big thing from that night, um, Levon Helm did not show up for the ceremony.
Hmm.
Um, so, is this still 16 years, 17 years later, the Robbie resentment? Do you have any, based on all of your research, what happened that
Yeah.
night?
Yeah. First of all, it was wonderful that they got in the Hall of Fame. Obviously, a band that influenced a lot. A couple of those artists that you named that were inducted the same year are also influenced by the band. Elton John has talked
Right.
about being influenced by the band. John Lennon and the Beatles loved music from Big Pink, and in that film Get Back that just came out, there's a scene where they kind of they do a couple little band numbers there, and they've talked about. And George Harrison was also a big advocate, along with Eric Clapton of the band.
Yeah.
So they were amongst their peers that respected them as well, and it was a big moment, I think, for the band too, because after years and trials and tribulations, it was a great honor amongst their peers. Um, Levon Helm had intended to go. The band was still operating, so
Yeah.
they were like, we're gonna play it. Levon was there in the city. He had his tuxedo. You get the little thing from Clapton at the end of the speeches about, oh, just wait and see. Levon's apparently in a limo. What ended up happening is he was going to go, and at the last moment he decided not to go. And I think that was because of Robbie. He didn't really want to perform with Robbie. They hadn't dealt with their issues. Um, you can see the things that Levon didn't like about Robbie were still present. They all give their speeches. The first thing Robbie says when he gets up to the lectern is, "I couldn't think of a better group of guys that could sing my songs," and he really kind of made note of that. And not to riff on that too hard, but that's a sore spot. That does not discredit Robbie. Robbie is a great songwriter.
Right.
Robbie wrote and continued to write great songs. But I think it was his lack of, I don't know. I think it was his a lack of ability to understand that it was a group thing, and it's very clearly a group thing, from arranging to unpacking songwriting credits and the legalities of that, to the
Right.
fact that, like, again, those first two albums, especially music from Big Pink, half the songs are written by Richard. Like, there's a lot that you can go on there, and I think that type of attitude really made Levon angry, and was the thesis to his hatred or resentment of
Yeah.
Robbie. And it sucked because it's a big missed opportunity. Um, Levon is, they consider Richard the lead singer. Richard, obviously, I think technically has the best voice. He's my favorite member, but Levon is the voice of the band. Their biggest hits, it's Levon singing them. The Wait,
Right.
primarily Levon. The Night They Drove Old Dixie Down, Up on Cripple Creek. Like, these staple songs happen to have Levon's voice attached. His southern iconic drawl is very much
Yeah.
something that is on the forefront. Obviously, hugely successful in his solo career with acting and music too. So like I think it was a bit of a shock that he wasn't there, and they sing The Weight, and you know, I think it was a disappointment because you see Clapton up there with them, which is great, and he has an amazing solo with them when they go through The Weight.
Yeah.
But Rick starts off the song, okay, cool, and then Robbie sings, and Robbie's not a great singer. It just kind of, the performance was a bit of a letdown,
Yeah.
ultimately, and Levon's the heart of that band. He
No,
you
no
know he
question.
was the rhythm. He needed to be there, and it was ultimately a big letdown. Does it, in the grand picture, does it discredit or minimize anything? No, but it's one of those things where you kind of wished he was there,
Yeah.
and that they had put aside their differences.
Yeah, and to your point earlier, how perhaps in the early '80s, some of those classic rock artists were kind of put aside. I think if they could have gotten their acts together in
Mm-hmm.
'95 and '96, they would have been huge coming out
Mm-hmm.
with Robbie. With my last question, and really appreciate your time this afternoon. You mentioned him earlier, Joe Forno Jr. Back in August of 21 on your podcast. He managed the band
Mm-hmm.
from '83, I think, right up until '94 or '95, and he mentioned this possibility of Robbie joining the band for like a 20 or 25 show tour
Yeah.
right around the Hall of Fame.
Yeah.
That was the first I had ever heard of that.
Yeah.
Subsequently, from your interview with Joe, have you done any more research on that? Have you seen any more information around the possibility of that happening at that point?
I haven't necessarily seen more of it. It was a surprise to me too. I don't. I take it though. Like, Joe is a very honest guy. I don't think he would have anything to gain
Right.
from saying that if it wasn't true. Also, he said some things about a lot of the different periods that people might not necessarily would have liked to hear, which I think is the best part about the book, because he was very honest. Joe was a guy that wasn't part of this world. He was a pharmacist. He was like just a regular guy, and he
Yeah.
kind of helped these guys because he cared about them on a deep personal level. You're right. Robbie's team approached to do it. There was multi-million dollars on the table to do the reunion tour with Robbie. And then ultimately Levon nixed that because he felt that they had built independently in the 90s. They had gotten back on their feet by themselves playing Woodstock 94. Levon had his book come out. They had Jericho come out to fairly solid critical acclaim. They didn't need him. And you know what? In a lot of ways, he was right. We've been doing it. We don't need you. Now you want to come back that we've got this sorted.
Right.
But at the same time, like, Robbie is a founding member of this group. It would have been remarkable if he came back. We might have got maybe even, not to be greedy, but you get a tour, cool, but maybe you get another album out of it. Maybe you put
Right.
these kind of things aside. But as we know, this isn't unique to them. Other groups are like this. Pink Floyd was like this. Creedence Clearwater Revival was like
Yeah.
this. You can name several bands. Almost Keith and Mick were almost like this. They're still not even that friendly, even though they kind of tolerate each other. This happens, and it's just an unfortunate reality of it. But yeah, huge missed opportunity. But they went on and they recorded another two albums as the band, and they all continued to have interesting solo careers, especially Robbie and Levon won multiple Grammys in the latter part of his life. He's the most decorated solo artist out of all of them, and he probably has the best solo albums out of all of them. He knew what he was and what he wanted to do, and that's commendable. And Robbie continued to develop an interesting career for himself as well. So ultimately, you could play guessing games about what would have happened here and there, but we were given what we were given, and I'm glad we got what we got. But yeah, I'm a band fan. I would have loved if they had gone back together.
No question. It must be something in the water in the rock and roll world where the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I mean, you think about it. I mean, even go back to the Beatles, where
Mm-hmm.
they didn't all show up. The Beach Boys didn't show up. Guns N' Roses Axl didn't show up. Van Halen was a mess.
That's right.
Creedence, you're right. John Fogerty would not play with the other two guys.
Mm-hmm.
The Egos kind of universally in the space must just be incredible that you can't pull it together for one night, but
Yeah.
yeah, missed, like you said, unfortunately missed opportunity, but we are grateful to have the music that we have. And I'm going to wrap up here. Tyrell, I really appreciate it. I wanted to give you the opportunity to plug your pod and your social stuff. So please.
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much. Firstly, thanks for having me on. I love talking about this type of stuff. If you guys are interested in the podcast at all, it's called The Band of History. You can find us online anywhere by just typing in The Band of History or The Band Podcast. We're all over social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, you name it. We're on there. We love having discussions, and we love bringing new people to the fold. These guys make great music, and it should be listened to and cherished. And if any of us in the community can get you on board and show you something new, I think we'd all love that. So thank you again, and thanks for letting me talk about the band.
Oh, thanks for talking about the band. And your next episode, what will you be focusing on?
Rick Danko's first solo album from 1977, again, self-titled, wonderful album. If you've watched The Last Waltz, there's one small scene where he actually samples the track Sip the Wine. It's one of the most compelling scenes of The Last Waltz, in my opinion, and that song is one of the great songs that Rick Danko ever wrote, and one of just the great songs of the 70s, and it's a phenomenal and underrated album, chocked full of guest appearances from all former band members as well as other greats like Eric Clapton and Ron Wood. So that'll be coming out soon. I just finished scripting it, so it'll be out very soon.
That's Java Blues is on that album. Is that correct?
Java Blues, one of the great tracks, one of I was just tweeting about that. Robbie Robertson, I think it might be, for me, his best guitar work on a recorded track ever. So, yeah.
That's saying a lot.
That is.
So thanks again. Really appreciate it. Thanks for everybody who watched Hall of Fame Road Trip. Billboard chart guy here. Thank you, Kirk Minahan, YouTube Network. Kirk and Dave, appreciate your support, and we'll be seeing you further on up the road. Take care.